I firstly want to express my thanks to Libraries NI and especially Angela, the branch manager here at Green Island Library, for inviting me along this evening to present this historical talk on the Ulster Revival of 1859. Firstly, I'm overwhelmed by the turnout tonight, and I really want to thank you all for coming. I hope we will have a good time together this evening, and I particularly hope that I will be able to pass on to you some of the passion that I have for this subject, and also that you will leave this evening better informed about the 1859 revival. Now, I am certainly not going to claim to be an expert on the subject, but I do have a good working knowledge of it, as I recently completed my Master of Arts dissertation in May past there, which was entitled An Examination of the Place of Prayer in the Ulster Revival of 1859, with special reference to County Antrim and its implications for revival in that area today. However, tonight we will be embarking on a broader study. We won't be as focused on one aspect of the revival, and we will be looking at the subject from more of a historical rather than a theological angle. Well, today in Northern Ireland, the year 1859 is nostalgically remembered by many evangelicals and even those in the wider community. Many people have heard of the 1859 revival. This was the year when an exceptional spiritual awakening swept over the province, leading to the conversion of over 100,000 men, women and children. And it has been variously described as the Year of Grace. This was actually a publication by William Gibson in 1860, and he called it the Year of Grace. It's been called God's River in Spate. And a description from our very own Dr. Paisley, looking quite attractive there. He said that was a time of refreshing from the presence of the Most High God. That was Dr. Paisley. Well, obviously, these are very positive descriptions, and naturally, this popular, affectionate image is not without its critics. But it is undeniable that the events of this year were significant, causing even the socio-political historian Peter Gibbon to argue that the Ulster religious revival of 1859 involved larger numbers of people in sustained common activity than any movement in rural Ulster between 1798 and 1913. And indeed, the editor of the Ballymena Observer reported on the 16th of July 1859, whatever difference of opinion there may be as to the predisposing or proximate cause of the prevailing impressions, it is impossible to doubt the solemnizing influence for good upon the great mass of the community. And that was a newspaper said that. Now, obviously, not everyone thought that the revival of 1859 was a good thing, and we will hear of some of these less positive assessments later on. But of course, all this talk of revival begs the question, what exactly is revival? Well, Donald Campbell, an eyewitness of the Hebrides revival, has offered this succinct definition. A revival is a community saturated with God. And this has recently been adapted by Brian Edwards, a revival historian, to a people saturated with God. Donald Campbell explains in more detail. Revival is a going out of God among his people and an awareness of God laying hold of the community. Now, this focus of God dealing with his own people initially, and then moving on to bless the wider community, is emphasised by Charles Finney, the great 19th century American theologian and evangelist. Finney proposes that revival is the renewal of the first love of Christians resulting in the awakening and conversion of sinners to God. He says, in the popular sense, a revival of religion in a community is the arousing, quickening and reclaiming of the more or less backslidden church and the more or less general awakening of all classes and ensuring attention to the claims of God. So that's what Finney thought of revival. But what was the state of religion in Ulster prior to 1859? Well, here we have a picture of the Reverend Dr. Henry Cook, and Dr. Cook was elected the moderator of the Presbyterian Synod of Ulster in 1824. When addressing the Synod a year later in 1825, he spoke of two diseases which he perceived in the religious life of that time. He criticised both the clergy and the laity, so both the leaders and their congregations were criticised. He describes the clergy as so conformed to the world of secularised employment, frivolous amusement, Epicurean indulgence and idle conversation that the eye searches in vain for the distinctive features of the primitive ministerial character. So that wasn't a very glowing report of the clergy, and I'm sure that our clergy in Green Island are not at all like that. But Cook equally had a go at the laity. As he proposes, they exhibit a spirit of indifferentism about religious truth, a charity which would sacrifice the truth to the errors of a false philosophy or a spurious gospel. And when Cook talks about the laity being taken in by a spurious gospel, that is heretical teaching, he would have been thinking of Arianism. You see, Presbyterianism had for some time, actually since the beginning of the 18th century, been struggling with Arianism within its ranks. Arianism essentially denies the full deity of Jesus Christ, claiming he's a created being and not the eternal Son of God. And Cook's vehement opposition to Arianism is reflected in the positioning of his statue outside the Royal Belfast Academical Institution, which we know better as INST, in the centre of Belfast. His back is turned to the school to reflect his dissatisfaction with the institution because they had elected William Bruce, an Arian, to the Hebrew and Classics chair in the early 1800s. So as a result of a toleration of Arianism within the Ulster Synod, some more orthodox Presbyterian ministers had already broken away to establish the Succession Church in Ulster, with all their ministers subscribing to the Westminster Confession of Faith. So here we have a divided Presbyterianism, its energies being used up fighting heretical teaching from within. But thankfully for Henry Cook here, after strenuous efforts against Arianism within its ranks, in 1835 the Ulster Synod enacted that all its ministers must subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith, which upheld the full divinity of Jesus. And this supposed doctrinal purifying of the Ulster Synod led eventually to the union of the Ulster and Succession Synods. They came together in one General Assembly in 1840. So now, with the establishment of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, there was a unity. And instead of having to use up its energy fighting heretical teaching from within, Presbyterians could now look out to the wider community and focus instead on evangelism. And so, at the 1844 General Assembly meeting, the attendees were exhorted to establish prayer meetings in every congregation. And the reason given for these prayer meetings was that our people generally be exhorted to wrestle with God more perseveringly for the outpouring of His Spirit on the church and the world. In fact, the first Sabbath in October 1844 was to be set aside as a special day of prayer specifically for revival. So here we have a people beginning to pray for and actually even expect revival. Indeed, the Reverend David Adams reported after the revival came to Oaxaca, there had been great preparation for the revival. It did not come so suddenly and unexpectedly as some imagine. He says, I have been most anxious for it ever since I became a minister, and he was ordained in 1841. Concurring with this, the Reverend Dill of Ballymena, he observed, the people were in a state of preparation, a state which passed into one of earnest expectancy when the glad news of the American revival reached our shores. Indeed, in June 1858, the Irish Presbyterian magazine expressed the hope that God may pour out upon us and on our churches such blessings as are falling on our American brethren. We have all the appliances of a church. What we need is the spark of the heavenly fire, the baptism of the Holy Spirit. So here we have a real desire for a similar blessing as that happening in America. But if you think it was only the Presbyterian Church that was looking for revival at this time, you would be wrong. Although the population in County Antrim at that time was chiefly Presbyterian, and many converts of the revival were Presbyterian, this did not prevent the Episcopalians receiving a blessing also. Indeed, the news of the American revival also impressed the established church, the Church of Ireland. Reverend Charles Seaver, the incumbent of St John's in Belfast, spoke of how before the revival, as in all the great works of God, a preparatory process had been going on. He speaks of this being heightened since the news of the great American revival reached us, leading to an increased activity in religious matters, increased meetings for prayer, especially with reference to the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, while pulpit teaching has been frequently directed to this subject. But what was this American revival that was being envied and talked about? Well, in September 1857, Jeremiah Lanphier, an American businessman and convert of Charles Finney, had begun a noonday prayer meeting on Wednesdays in a New York church. In fact, there's the Jeremiah Lanphier statue still today in New York, outside the American Bible Society. It's in Brooklyn, and he's sitting here on the bench, his arms are outstretched, and he's trying to call the people to prayer. And so Lanphier and others were meeting for prayer once a week, but the growing number of intercessors decided to meet daily instead in early October. Now, at the peak of this revival in New York, 21 daily meetings were held in Manhattan with 6 others in Brooklyn, and each of these prayer meetings were attended by large crowds. In fact, the New York Times of the 22nd March 1858 reported that at the prayer meeting at Burton's Theatre there was an immense crowd of 3,000, among whom there was not the least confusion or disorder. Within 6 months, over 12,000 businessmen met daily across New York for prayer, while similar meetings were springing up across America. From February to June in 1858, in this laity-led movement, around 50,000 people a week were converted in a nation whose population was only 30 million. So it was reported by the Presbyterian Missionary Herald that the prominent and perhaps most hopeful characteristic of this revival in America is prayer. Hence its name, the Layman's Prayer Revival. Well, this appreciation of the value of prayer was also acknowledged across the Atlantic Ocean. In the same month and year as Jeremiah Lanphier had begun his lunchtime prayer meeting in New York, that is September 1857, in a small rural community in the Kells and Connor district of County Antrim, another Jeremiah Neely, and his 3 friends, James McQuilkin, Robert Carlyle and John Wallace, met in the old schoolhouse near Kells to pray for spiritual awakening in their own homeland. And here we now have a nice picture of Kells today, a nice picturesque village, and the Kells Schoolhouse is still there today in Kells. It is now a privately owned dwelling, and I had to commandeer my poor daughter and my husband to go out and take photos of this, and we were peering through bushes so as not to disturb the poor lady who owns this house, because it's not open to the public. If I had it, I'd have it opened and be charging probably, but no, she hasn't it opened, and there it is today. The old Kells Schoolhouse is still there, where those four men met for prayer. Comparing the revival in Connor to its American counterpart, the Reverend S.J. Moore observes, prayer, fervent, confiding and unceasing, was and continues to be the prominent characteristic of the one and of the other. But how had this prayer meeting in the old Kells Schoolhouse come about? Well, in the spring of 1856, an English lady by the name of Mrs. Colville came to Ballymena from Gateshead as a Baptist missionary, carrying out visitation and tract distribution. So all you Baptists, take note. Sadly, her family had disowned her when she was converted. Now, Mrs. Colville, she was influential in the conversion of a young man, James McQuilkin. She had a conversation with McQuilkin, which started him thinking about the nature of salvation. She planted the seed, as it were, and shortly after this, he was converted under the preaching of the Reverend William Campbell, a Methodist missionary who was holding special services in the town of Antrim. Now, what do I mean by converted? I've been using that term a lot. Well, in James McQuilkin's case, and many more before and following him, he was aware of a terrible burden of guilt. Guilt for the sin in his life, and he wanted to be free from his burden. He wanted to be right with God. Talking about his conversion, he describes experiencing a personal encounter with Jesus. This was no mere joining a church or adhering to a creed. This was a changed life. Well, McQuilkin, he came from the parish of Connor, about 5 miles from Ballymena, and he worked in a linen warehouse in the town, but he would return home to Kells and Connor every weekend. And prior to his conversion, he was known in the village as the man who reared fighting cockerels, and this was a cruel and bloody sport. Now, however, since his conversion, his outlook on life had changed. He came under the influence of the Reverend John Hamilton Moore, the minister of Connor Presbyterian Church, and Connor Presbyterian is still there today. It's on the same site as the old Connor Presbyterian Church. The Reverend Moore has been described as a profound theologian, a highly original thinker, a diligent reader and an impressive preacher. Hypocrisy, double-mindedness, pretense were not to be breathed in the same breath with the name of John Hamilton Moore. He was sterling and genuine to the heart's core. And the Reverend Moore urged upon James McQuilkin the duty of doing something more for God. And he encouraged him to gather some of his converted friends together and commence a Sabbath school at Tawny Brack near the village of Connor. There's yours truly standing at the commemorative stone. The Sabbath school is no longer there, but this stone marks the Sabbath school where McQuilkin and his friends laboured. Well, McQuilkin and his 3 friends, Jeremiah Maneely, John Wallace, Robert Carlyle, felt their own inadequacies and inexperience in this Sabbath school work. And so, in the autumn of 1857, they met in the old schoolhouse near Kells for prayer. So that is how the prayer meeting came into existence. They met on Friday evenings, and each man took an armful of peat for the fire, and the other, in his other arm, he carried his Bible. And in an interview with J.G. Lawson in 1903, Jeremiah Maneely described the prayer meeting as a fellowship meeting of Christians met for the one great object of praying for an outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon ourselves and upon the surrounding country. This was the one great object and burden of our prayers. We held right to the one thing and did not run off to anything else. However, unlike the rapid growth of the New York prayer meeting that had begun in the same month and year as its Connor counterpart, the prayer band of 4 young men in the Kells schoolhouse grew at a much slower rate. A few like-minded believers were added to their number, but it was not until December 1857, a few months later, that conversions began to occur. And by the end of 1858, 50 young men were taking part in the fellowship. To avoid the charge that the prayer meeting was held only for the purpose of flirtation, for the first year women were not allowed to attend. However, this did not stop the women organising their own prayer meeting. Well, here we have the beautiful ornate Connor signpost. You can see that today. And if you look closely, there's also a portrait of James McQuilkin with his Bible painted in one section. And around the time of the spring communion of 1859 in Connor, things had begun to progress. The Reverend S.J. Moore, the brother of the Reverend John H. Moore of Connor, he spoke of the old prayer meetings in the district being thronged and many new ones established. He says no difficulty now to find persons to take part in them. In fact, he details that there were on average 16 prayer meetings every night in the week, about 100 weekly, connected with that one congregation alone. And I know a lot of our churches struggle to fill one prayer meeting, so that was 100 weekly. Through the influence and prayers of the Connor Fellowship in the old schoolhouse at Kells, a young man called Samuel Campbell was converted, and being a native of Ahuckle, was instrumental in the spread of revival to that district. The Reverend David Adams of the First Presbyterian Congregation in Ahuckle recalls how meetings for praise, prayer, reading of the Bible and exhortation were being held every night, and frequently at midday at the busiest seasons in kitchens, barns, schoolhouses, churches, fields, wayside and hedgeside, while secret and family prayer became very general. The Reverend Adams recounts how the new church, capable of holding 1,200 people, was ready just in time for the revival, as it was opened in 1858. The Reverend Adams comments, "I regard it as a singular token of God's good providence that it was just ready for the great revival harvest." He says, "Some of my people thought it folly to attempt building such a large, handsome place of worship, but the Lord, notwithstanding, led us in the right way, as all now thankfully admit." And the first Great Awakening in Ahuckle took place in this church on the 14th of March 1859 at the Thanksgiving service on the Monday following the Communion Sabbath. The Ballymena Observer reported that as many as 3,000 people were present, comprising persons of every creed from the Episcopalian to the Roman Catholic. The congregation had heard a rumour that the converts from Connor were coming to speak. However, the beginning of the service was conducted by the Reverend David Adams of Ahuckle. Unfortunately, a portion of the congregation became impatient to hear the Connor converts, and there was such a commotion that the Reverend Adams was afraid the gallery or the balcony in the church would not carry the weight of the people, and so in the interest of safety, everyone had to be dismissed from the building. Today, actually, if you go to First Ahuckle, thankfully it's still there, although they've built a beautiful, beautiful new building. They've kept this old one as well. And the gallery still bears the effects of this event as it is visibly sunken to one side. Well, the congregation retired outside and they listened to James Bankhead and other converts in muddy streets caused by heavy rain, and hundreds fell on their knees in the mud, and many people were prostrated under an intense conviction of sin. This was the beginnings of the physical strikings or prostrations that would be such a noteworthy part of the revival and more will be said of these later. Well, when revival spread to neighbouring Ballymena, extensive prayer was once again in evidence. And there were at least 16 streets in Ballymena where prayer meetings were avidly attended. Indeed, Ballymena was also the scene of prayer meetings across the denominational divide. These were known as United or Union prayer meetings, and a weekly midday prayer meeting was held in the town hall and was led by the Episcopalian, Wesleyan and Presbyterian ministers of the town. This soon became 3 meetings each week, one of which took place on Saturday afternoons to accommodate those attending the weekend market. Around this time, the Ballymena Observer records how a young man, about 30 years of age, as he was walking along Galborn Street, just dropped to his knees in the middle of the street and alarmed the entire neighbourhood with loud and desperate cries. Many people ran to the scene, believing that this man was being attacked by some assailant, only to find that this man was under deep conviction of sin and was crying repeatedly, "Unclean, unclean, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner." He was assisted by some friends into a house where he was counselled and later found release from his guilt of sin and was converted. And this sort of scene was happening more and more regularly. Of course, the revival was not confined to rural areas, but soon made its way to the major towns, including Belfast. And when revival reached Belfast in late May, many Roman Catholics were also brought under its influence, as of the 120,000 population of Belfast at that time, 40,000 were Roman Catholics. The pressures of counselling so many seeking souls led to a weekly union meeting, which was held in a music hall in May Street, and it commenced on the 14th of June. The music hall was later known as Victoria Memorial Hall, but it was unfortunately demolished in 1983, so this beautiful building has now gone. The Reverend James Morgan of Fisherwick Presbyterian and the Reverend Charles Seaver, rector of St John's, were the joint secretaries of this weekly United prayer meeting. It is reported that the building was always crowded to excess, and the prayers of those present were described as passionate and to the point. And it was soon found that brethren who could not see eye to eye about certain ecclesiastical matters were able to agree together about the salvation of souls. However, the great United prayer meeting in the Botanic Gardens in Belfast on the 29th June 1859 is perhaps the most famed of the revival. There was an attendance of between 35 and 40,000 people, causing the Belfast newsletter to report, and remember this is a newspaper, "Is not this in itself a testimony that a great change has taken place in the views and feelings of the masses of the population when a religious service induced so many to leave their homes for the purpose of attending it?" Well, the crowd had come from every part of the city and the province. Special trains filled with joyous singing converts brought 15,000 from places as far away as Coleraine and Portrush, and from counties Armagh and Tyrone. And considering motor cars were as yet unheard of, and buses not even a dream of the future, it is a remarkable fact that a gathering of that size was even possible. The Belfast newsletter reports how they carried their Bibles and hymn books in their hands, and ignoring the shops which were open, they made their way resolutely and reverently to the Royal Botanical Gardens. However, we must remember that at this time there were no microphones like tonight. There were no amplifiers or loudspeakers with which to reach a very large audience. So despite the best efforts of the speakers to make themselves heard by the vast crowd, it was impossible. And so there sprang up as many as 30 smaller groups with around 1,000 people to each. And these were placed in the charge of trusted and capable leaders. And during the service, which lasted 4 hours, it is recorded that many cried out to God for mercy. A lovely story recounts how that evening, as the trains took the crowds home, all that could be heard was the joyous singing of the well-known revival hymn, "What's the News?" Now, many great evangelical hymns were used in the Ulster Awakening, hymns such as "There is a Fountain Filled with Blood," "Just as I Am Without One Plea," and "All Hail the Power of Jesus' Name." However, the most widely sung hymn of 1859, written especially for this time of revival, was this song, "What's the News?" Indeed, it is still sung in many congregations today, and it certainly sums up the excitement and expectation that surrounded that very special time in Ulster. 3 of its 6 verses read like this: "Whene'er we meet, you always say, 'What's the news? What's the news?' Pray, what's the order of the day? What's the news? What's the news? Oh, I have got good news to tell. My Saviour hath done all things well, and triumphed over death and hell. That's the news, that's the news. His work's reviving all around, that's the news, that's the news. And many have redemption found, that's the news, that's the news. And since their souls have caught the flame, they shout hosannas to his name, and all around they spread his fame. That's the news, that's the news. And now if anyone should say, 'What's the news? What's the news?' Oh, tell them you've begun to pray. That's the news, that you have joined the conquering band, and now with joy at God's command, you're marching to the better land. That's the news, that's the news." So that's 3 of those verses. Of course, we haven't said much about the Methodists. And at this time, there were several branches of Methodism in Belfast, and in their various churches, the revival was also enthusiastically supported. They were particularly known for their large open-air gatherings during 1859. One such meeting coincided with their Conference of Wesleyan Methodists in Eglinton Street, at which 15,000 people attended. The crowd was so great that it ultimately broke up into 4 separate gatherings, so that all the people could effectively hear. 2 weeks later, the well-known evangelist Dr. Henry Grattan Guinness was the speaker announced, at which 30,000 attended. And although these meetings were arranged by Methodist ministers, there was an excellent spirit of cooperation at all these gatherings, and others who took part were the Reverend Dr. William Johnson from Townsend Street Presbyterian and the Reverend Mr. Crone of the Evangelical Union Church. Well, here's our orange men. One of the most striking occurrences of the revival year was the exemplary conduct of the crowds on the 12th of July, 1859. In the marching season in July 1857, 2 years before the revival, rioting had been rampant in Belfast. However, in 1859, in Ballymena, before the commencement of the day's parades, there was an open-air meeting for united prayer at 1 o'clock. The Ballymena Observer records how the Orange men in that area had displayed exemplary conduct. They paraded in quiet and solemn procession, without banners, ribbons, drums or music, warrants or firearms. Instead, thousands carried Bibles, and at 4 o'clock left the field where they were assembled, in the same quiet and orderly manner in which they had entered it. But about 2,000 people of the neighbourhood remained in assemblage and were occupied in religious exercises till 9 p.m. So the same newspaper reported that there was not a single arrest for drunkenness, nor any recorded charge of intoxication made in Ballymena during the entire day or the succeeding night. The report goes on: "Empty cells are easily guarded, and the governor of our Bridewell had a holiday." Now, Bridewell was the local prison. So that same day, at Resharkin, there was an open-air prayer meeting, which the Ballymena Observer reported was very numerously attended, whilst a similar united prayer meeting at Randallstown was attended by about 6,000 Orangemen of that district, not one of whom appeared with the slightest emblem of the brotherhood, and all was peace. The same newspaper reports of a united prayer meeting at O'Hockle at 12 noon, at which 6,000 attended, and the report enthuses, and again remember this is a newspaper, the report enthuses that of those present there was no drinking, no disorder, no provoking words, no impropriety of conduct. This is a glorious change. It is the work of God. It is the delightful result of this gracious revival. Well, towns all over County Antrim and throughout Ulster were experiencing a marked increase in prayer. The Ballymena Observer recounts how prayer meetings in our own Carrickfergus were numerous and well attended. Indeed, Mrs. Colville, who we heard about in connection with the conversion of James McQuilkin, she also visited Carrickfergus along with a Lieutenant W.R. Aikman, and she carried out extensive evangelism in the area. Mrs. Colville set up a chain of ladies' prayer meetings. And in the week after the Communion Sabbath of the 5th of June, an open-air meeting was held in the Scotch Quarter. It was said that more persons assembled for the worship of God in Carrickfergus than in the history of this town ever met on any previous occasion for a similar purpose. In 1851, salt had been discovered on the Marquis of Downshire's property, and a company was formed to work the mines. Now obviously it didn't look like that in those days, that's now. During the revival, the men in these local salt works met regularly for prayer 700 feet underground, and all the workers were provided with Bibles. In fact, the workers would usually have spent most of their time gambling during their meal times. However, when the revival came, they instead spent their meal times reading the scriptures and singing psalms. Down the road a little, in Islamagee, the Reverend William Campbell of First Islamagee Presbyterian documents how prayer meetings have been established in many localities all over the district and are well attended by worshippers. Similarly, the Reverend Joseph Barclay of Carmully Presbyterian, he describes how 20 prayer meetings and upwards are being held weekly within the bounds of this single congregation. Whilst the Reverend John Stewart of Ballycarry records how more than 1,000 persons attend the weeknight prayer meetings in connection with his congregation. In fact, at Ballycarry, no buildings were big enough to contain the crowds coming to the prayer meetings, and on Sundays they often had to resort to the fair green and hold open-air meetings because the church could not accommodate the large crowds attending. Well, obviously not everyone extolled the revival as a work of God's Spirit, and 2 Presbyterian ministers published their criticisms of the movement. Isaac Nelson's The Year of Delusion in 1861. This was a response to Gibson's The Year of Grace, so he played on those words, and he said The Year of Delusion. And William Hamilton's An Inquiry into the Scriptural Character of the Revival of 1859, and he published that in 1866. Now, to say it was very difficult for these men to attack a movement that at the time was believed to be a mighty work of God is an understatement. Hamilton rightly discerns to question its truthfulness is to incur the displeasure of multitudes. And Hamilton's reticence is obvious when he says, "We tremble at the task, but we must proceed. To occupy a neutral position is impossible." Isaac Nelson's reserve is perhaps not as apparent, especially when he vehemently condemns the revival as disgraceful to Christianity, a corruption of gospel truth, and the means of filling the Presbyterian Church with vice and immorality under the sanction of religion. Now, Dr. Myrtle Hill, the socio-political historian from Queen's University, Belfast, she explains that Nelson's opposition may have originated from personal bitterness resulting from his having been passed over for a chair in Greek at the Presbyterian College. And certainly George Gilfillan, one of his contemporaries, concurs with this, suggesting that he was in some measure disappointed in ambition. Okay, and up here we see, this is the Nelson Memorial Church, and just off the Shankill, and here's his grave, which is on the back wall of the Shankill Cemetery. You can still see it there. Well, unfortunately, his fellow objector, the William Hamilton, fixates on the sensational occurrences of the awakening, to the detriment of properly considering the other aspects. He focuses in on the strikings or prostrations of the revival. Now, the Reverend S.J. Moore has graphically described what happens to these stricken ones who are under deep conviction of sin. He says this, he's an eyewitness, he says, "They fall as nerveless and paralysed and powerless, as if killed instantly by a gunshot. They fall with a deep groan, some with a wild cry of horror, the greater number with an intensely earnest plea, 'Lord Jesus, have mercy on my soul.' The whole frame trembles like an aspen leaf, an intolerable weight is felt upon the chest, a choking sensation is experienced, and relief from this found only in the loud, urgent prayer for deliverance." Hamilton is at pains to attribute these physical occurrences to demonic influence. However, even he identifies instances of holy prostrations in the biblical accounts. The prostrations of the Apostle Paul, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the Apostle John are all considered. One of the reasons why he claims the biblical prostrations are not similar to those of the Ulster Awakening is because in the biblical instances the men concerned fell face downwards, whereas in 1859 many who were prostrated had upturned faces. So make of that what you will. The revival historian Brian Edwards suggests that Hamilton's copious references to Scripture tie God to an inflexible regime. Of course, it is acknowledged that leaders need remarkable wisdom in times of revival to discern the genuine from the counterfeit. Nevertheless, often a revival can be full of the unexpected. Indeed, whilst indicating that in his district of Ballymena there was only one case of physical prostration in every 20 conversions anyhow, the Reverend S.J. Moore asks, "May not the free sovereign spirit work as he pleases?" And anyone who has read the lament ascribed to King David in Psalm 38 when he was experiencing deep suffering on account of sin will be struck at how similar King David's experience is to the stricken of the Ulster Awakening. Of course, there was an accusation that the prostrations were caused by hysteria, exacerbated by large crowds. However, it must be remembered that many of these prostrations happened outside of the context of a revival meeting. Indeed, in Ballycarry, the Reverend John Stewart speaks of great numbers being prostrated in their own homes, and one girl being stricken in the highway on her way home from a prayer meeting. Now, setting aside the issue of the prostrations, there was a general charge against the revival movement that it was the work of the devil. And many of the Roman Catholic priesthood called it a satanic delusion. However, one Roman Catholic gentleman who had seen much of the revival for himself commented, "My friends, all I have to say is, if the devil has done this, there must be a new devil, for I'm very sure the old one wouldn't do it at all." Indeed, the Reverend Alex McCreary of Killilea put it well when he commented at the time, "The effect of the present movement has been to drive men away from the places where Satan's throne is, and from the practices which Satan desires, to the places where Christ meets his people, and that is done which he delights in." And additionally, the Reverend Hugh Hannah of Berry Street, Belfast, avowed that of the 800 awakened souls of whom he had evidence, he says, "the change in their conduct is so marked and so marvellous and altogether so satisfactory that if indeed it be a work of the devil, then do I most earnestly pray that the devil may lay his hand on many others." William Hamilton also vehemently criticised lay ministry during the revival. He called it a direct interference with the divine arrangement. However, much of the lay preaching in 1859 was made up of testimonies to what God had accomplished in the lives of the converts, reminiscent of the testimony of the apostles Peter and John in Acts 4:20, when they said, "We cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard." The Reverend S.M. Dill recounts how in public meetings these converts, who had a very imperfect education and with no power of language, suddenly acquired a marvellous fluency as well as a fervour in prayer. Hamilton forgets how valuable the laity were to the clergy at the time, as the clergy on occasions were unable to gain appropriate rest because of relentless counselling of seeking souls. And on occasions, Hamilton's tirade against the utilisation of the laity appears to arise from jealousy. Indeed, according to the census of 1871, this laity-led revival movement did eventually lead to a dramatic rise in membership of groups like the Baptists and Plymouth Brethren. Indeed, Jeremiah Maneely, one of the 4 intercessors from the famed Kells Schoolhouse, he became a founding member of the Ballymacveigh Gospel Hall, the first Brethren meeting in Ulster. The same 1871 census indicated a decrease of church members among the Presbyterians from 528,992 to 503,461 members. Now here we actually have a picture. Ballymacveigh moved into Kells Village, and they're now Kells Gospel Hall, still going strong, and they have an outreach Sunday school in Creevery Gospel Hall, which is just outside Antrim. So there you are, Jeremiah Maneely had founded that 1859, still going strong today in our province. Well, what can be said is that the benefits of the revival to society at large were many. In terms of public morality alone, the number of prisoners for trial at the quarter sessions for County Antrim in October 1859, that's a mere 6 months after the commencement of the revival, was exactly half that of the previous year. 14 for trial in October 1858 and only 7 for trial in October 1859. Indeed, at the 1860 quarter sessions in Ballymena, which was the epicentre of the revival, there was not a single case of indictment on the record. On the temperance question, it should be known that before the revival, from about 1820 until 1829, the amount of alcohol consumed in Ulster doubled. And when it is remembered that on the county road from Belfast to Antrim, that's approximately 14 miles, there were 23 public houses, something needed to happen to improve this state of affairs. And of course something was done, and the temperance movement emerged, and by 1843 2 million Irishmen out of a total population of about 8 million had signed a pledge of temperance. The famine, however, undid much of this progress, and under the hardship of those times many returned to intemperate ways. One of the immediate effects of the revival was the re-establishment of greater sobriety and temperance. In Coleraine, the excise figures for the first month after the revival showed a drop of £400, and many public houses had to close. Indeed, at the licensing sessions held at Crumlin, County Antrim in October 1859, 10 publicans declined to seek renewals. 6 others applied for and obtained renewals solely in order to obtain time to dispose of their remaining stock, with a view to giving up what they had reason to regard as, in that district at least, the ruined trade of a publican. On the 27th of June 1859, a meeting was called in Joymount Presbyterian in Carrickfergus for the purpose of signing a total abstinence society. It is reported by the Reverend Warwick that 114 signed up to this, and that even a year later all had adhered firmly to their pledge. Well, in our land today, I am sure many would be anxious to see a return to those revival days, especially when it is considered that in the 2012 Northern Ireland Omnibus survey, 63% of respondents voiced concerns about underage drinking in their local communities. And this is coupled with a recent American study which found that young people who began drinking before the age of 15 were 4 times more likely to develop alcohol dependence than those who began drinking at the age of 21, then the levels of intemperance in our land at this time, especially amongst our young, should cause us concern. However, the question must be asked, why did the revival come to an end? The Reverend William Haslam has put it well when he says, as a fact, it is well known that revivals begin and continue for a time, and that they cease as mysteriously as they began. In fact, most revivals of religion, they unfortunately only tend to last for one generation. Certainly revival pulls the church out of its rut, it awakens it from its sleep and sets inertia in motion. However, in 1929, Martin Lloyd-Jones, the famous Welsh preacher, he explained that revival is not intended to be the normal life of the church. He comments, there are not only the great experiences, but also the ordinary, everyday experiences. The church is not meant always to be in a state of revival, but is also to do ordinary, everyday work. Well, in conclusion, how are we to explain this revival of 1859? As Robert Pope observes in his article about the Welsh revival of 1904-5, no one explanation of the cause of the revival will satisfy all. Appeals to religious practice and the power of prayer will not convince the secularly minded, while explanations that emphasise the social and political context will not appeal to those of faith. Therefore, what you think of the revival depends on your worldview, whether that be a biblical worldview or a secular or humanist worldview, etc. Thus, Peter Gibbon, who doesn't hold a biblical worldview, has argued instead for a socio-economic cause of the revival. He says it came about as the consequence of the displacement caused by fundamental changes in linen production. However, Professor Sean Connolly of Queen's University of Belfast has carried out a detailed study of Irish religious history, and although he allows for the importance of social and political context, he concludes that the responses brought forth by the revival cannot be convincingly reduced to a basis in class, gender or economic experience. What can be said is that when a thorough examination of revivals is carried out by church historians, they undoubtedly discover that prayer plays a major role prior to and during each revival. Thus A.T. Pearson, the 19th century Presbyterian pastor, argued, from the day of Pentecost there has been not one great spiritual awakening in any land which has not begun in a union of prayer. Though only among 2 or 3, no such upward movement has continued after such prayer meetings have declined. And more recently, Henry Blackby, who's a revival historian, he has noted, perhaps the only common denominator you find when you study the facets related to revival is prayer. You never need to peer back far to discover that in every great outpouring of God's Spirit, people were praying. Prayer always precedes revival. Of course, Blackby is also anxious to point out that prayer is not a guarantee of revival, as God remains sovereign, and revival only happens on his terms and in his time. But what about the prospect of revival today in our land? Well, even in this time of relative peace in Northern Ireland, it is acknowledged that sectarian tensions are still prevalent, as well as spiritual and moral decline. And many Christians observe the situation and they increasingly yearn for a time of province-wide spiritual awakening, as in 1859. And Leonard Ravenhill, the revival author, has rightly recognised the vital need for prayer for revival in the church today. His challenging, timely words are a fitting conclusion to this presentation this evening. He says, without exception, all true revivals of the past began after years of agonising, hell-robbing, earth-shaking, heaven-sent intercession. The secret to true revival in our own day is still the same. But where, oh where, are the intercessors?